You're going to have to forgive me. I brought notes, so I'll be referring to my notes, and I'll explain why in a second, or you'll realize in a second. But before that, I wanted to thank you for inviting me here. It's a great honor for me, especially since my journey in exploring this relationship and learning about this relationship actually began with Alan Corbiere, Dr. John Burroughs, as well as Rick Hill, who is not here today, and Justice Murray Sinclair. I was at a conference in 2003, I believe, and I went there because I've always been interested in the Crown, and I kept on encountering treaties, but I didn't understand what treaties were, and so I went to this conference because I thought that it was all about the Royal Proclamation, and I was ready to be informed that the Royal Proclamation was this very important thing, and I was given a proper education by going there, and that has led me to here. So I want to thank them publicly for that, because any information that I give has been passed on to me by their teachings and their writings. I'm a non-Indigenous person, and I'm a teacher at Waterdown District High School, and I teach. I've been teaching Canadian history for some time, and now from a non-Indigenous perspective, I'm teaching Indigenous studies. And I had no idea how much from that conference in 2013, how much that would become part of my life. In the Indigenous Studies program that I'm teaching right now, I'm partnered with an Indigenous teacher from the Mohawk Nation, and we kind of explore issues that our students will bring to us and that are in the news, and we try to teach them what the treaty relationship is from both our perspectives. And just to give you an idea of how much this has become part of my life, we were visiting Mohawk College, and I had the great fortune of meeting an elder named Elder Bertha Skye. And Elder Bertha had made this tea, and it was wonderful. We had the kids there, and they were listening to Elder Bertha, and I was just drinking this tea. And she leaned over to me, and she said, "You better be careful. That's fertility tea." I said, "Elder Bertha, there's no danger of that. I've had a procedure. It's not going to happen." I now have a 3-month-old at home. So that's why I have the notes. Driving up here, up the Bruce Peninsula, brought back a lot of good memories for me. I used to have a family cottage in Muskoka, and there's a series of lakes there. And I've never been one for the water. I don't like being in the water, but I love being on the water. And my family knew that, and so they bought me a canoe one year, and they just kind of shoved me off into the water. And so from the age of 12 until we no longer had the cottage about 5 years ago, I've been on the water in this canoe. And as a boy, I would kind of travel around and explore the areas. And what would start happening is I didn't like the maps that already existed, so I threw them out. And I made my own maps from things that I saw. And I started naming places. And so here's a classic, this is the next lake over, which we called the New World. And, we gave islands names like, grandiose names like Royal Avant-Garde and Royal Neverland Island. And there was actually a time when I grabbed a leaf from one island with a friend. We had gone on this great big canoe trip to this island, which the map had called Big Island, but we named it Britannia. We wanted something grandiose, right? And I've always been interested in history. So we get this leaf and we bring it back to the cottage. And I said, we've got to send it to someone important. And the Queen was visiting, and she was on CTV News, which was the only channel that we got there. Some of you might remember when you'd only get one channel, right? And I said, well, the Queen's really important. Let's send it to the Queen. And so we sent this leaf to the Queen. And we got a letter back within 2 weeks. They're pretty prompt. And so to remember that, we started a tradition of sending leaves from islands, and then the ones where we get a letter back, we'd add royal to. So the Crown has always been an important kind of part of my youth in an indirect way, and it turned into an interest for me growing up. But it was really associated with growing up on the cottage and exploring these islands. We have maps and maps and maps. So when I went to university, I wanted to remember these stories because I could feel as I was getting older that I was going to start forgetting these stories. And so I met up with a professor, and every week Her name was, or is Susan Scott. Every week we'd get together at her house, and I would write out these stories and I'd give them to her. And then she very gently would give them back to me with all of her critiques. And we did this for a number of years. We called it my thesis. And at the end of it, we published it, self-published it, into a book with all these different stories. And now I put inserts and pictures and stuff like that. And when I thought I was done, she says, "Okay, Nathan, you think you're done?" She said, "Now how are you going to deal with the themes of colonization that you've presented? Because of course you're an imperialist," is what she called me. And I kind of recoiled at that. But she was bang on, wasn't she? Right? Because I had overlaid my identity on all these places. And I can remember as a boy when I would encounter people and they would say, "Oh no, the name of this island isn't this. This is the name." Or they would start telling me their own stories of things, shenanigans that they got up to out and about. And I would not like that because it implied that I had lost control over that area in some way. And so she said, "You need to write a new book, and you need to address that." And then I became a Canadian history teacher. And I mean, isn't that our story, right? As I'm driving up the Bruce Peninsula, there's all of these names that have been placed on this land. And Alan spoke about the importance of language as being one of the first things. Family and language targeted by residential schools, because with language is identity and everything. And that was a valuable lesson. As a teacher, I didn't even begin to address Indigenous perspectives until I went to the Mush Hole, which is the residential school at Brantford. It hadn't even crossed my mind as a teacher because we weren't taught that. It wasn't in the textbook, right? And that's when I realized I needed to re-examine things. And then with my interest in the Crown, I knew I had to re-examine that. And that's when I started encountering the writings of Dr. Burroughs and the teachings of Alan, and that's what led me to that conference in 2013. Right now, this country, we are in they call it this era of reconciliation, and I think it's a good thing, but I worry about it as well because the word is getting thrown around a lot. And and the pun is intended. I think there's a danger it could become white noise, especially when politicians are using it. And so we have to be mindful of that, and we have to we have to kind of focus more on the truth. That's what I've been trying to focus on, is what is the truth, and what is my obligation as a non-Indigenous person on these lands, and as someone who wants to be part of that treaty relationship. And what institutions did we as non-Indigenous people use to engage? So that's been kind of my journey. Just recently, we have had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I know Brian, or somebody was telling me that there is a local group that is looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And these calls to action, and they're deliberately called calls to action, not recommendations, because recommendations, I've been told, can too easily be shelved. So calls to action 45 says, "We call upon the Government of Canada, on behalf of all Canadians, to jointly develop with Aboriginal peoples a royal proclamation of reconciliation to be issued by the Crown. And the proclamation would build on the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. And I noticed in Alan's slides that he was showing, he was going to talk talk to you about the Treaty of Niagara. I will try to do a minutia of justice to it that he would have done. And reaffirm the nation-to-nation relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown. And the report goes on to describe this as necessary in establishing what it calls a covenant of reconciliation." And so the original royal proclamation that we have to go to was issued in the name of King George III, following the defeat of New France in 1763. And it's often held up by the Government of Canada as the Indian Magna Carta. That's actually on a lot of websites still to this day. Because near the end, and after much negotiating, it recognized Indian nations, and it placed them under the protection of the Crown. Now, during that conference that I was at in 2013, we were reminded by Justice Murray Sinclair. He stood up and he said he loved the Royal Proclamation and he hated the Royal Proclamation. He loved it because of, yes, it did give recognition, But he said, I didn't need someone in some far-off land wearing a funny hat to tell me that I existed. And he also said, I hate the Royal Proclamation because it provided the framework in which to divest people of land. The King's representative in British North America during that time, after the 7 Years' War, was an Irishman named Sir William Johnson. Now, he's an interesting character, and he said that since he was Irish, he knew how to handle the English. Okay, so he lived in what is now upstate New York, in a very close relationship with the Mohawk, and in fact, his partner, wife and all but name, was the extraordinary Molly Brant, who is a Haudenosaunee clan mother, a really remarkable woman. He spoke the language, and he worked with the Mohawk Nation, but he also benefited from them as well. Following Governor General Jeffrey Amherst's genocidal attempts to try and impose British interests on the Indigenous allies of the French after the conquest, Johnson began lobbying the imperial government that rather than military force, a partnership needed to be kindled in these lands on Indigenous terms, employing Indigenous diplomacy in order for something like the Royal Proclamation to be accepted. In late 1763, Amherst, who's most famous for using blankets laced with smallpox to try and wipe out the Indigenous allies, so an instance of biological warfare, he's recalled to London, and the path was cleared for Johnson to negotiate the Treaty of Niagara. The very existence of something called the Covenant Chain Wampum, and that's this here. I recovered this from, I had to drive to Toronto to pick this up so I could show it to you. This is it here. I heard Alan read this, and it was, I think, 2.5 hours, and you said it was the Coles Notes when you read it. It's a remarkable document. The very fact that this exists, this was presented by Sir William Johnson to the assembled nations near the banks of the Niagara River at the end of this great council. So he calls a council in 1764. He gathers nations from all over these lands, and they gather at Niagara. If you know Niagara on the Lake, they say that the spot was where the Commons is today, so across from Fort George. And Sir William Johnson, he stayed in Fort Niagara across the river. And those that were in treaty with the Crown or in relationship with the Crown, they stayed with him at Fort Niagara. And those that were not stayed on this side of the Niagara River. And at the end, he crosses the river and he presents this belt. And what I show students all the time is this idea here in the center. This belt was made by Ken Miracle. He's the Cayuga Nation. And here's the king. And I was told that you can tell it's the king because there's the neck here, the head, and there's a box on the head. That's the crown, right? Because in our society, you know, people who have the most bling, the most diamonds and jewelry, and most headgear, they're the important ones. And then over here we have an Indigenous representative, and there's 2 lines sticking out either side, and that could be from the headdress that had antlers for some. And in between, Ken told me that that's the Royal Proclamation, binding them together. But the important thing is that they're equal. They're not tilted, that they're presented as equals. And they're bound together in this strong relationship. Here's a close-up here where you can see. You can come and see it, and please do at the end. It tells us that the settler population once got it because this belt was created by Sir William Johnson. This isn't an Indigenous artifact, it's a viceregal one, a royal one, a diplomatic device employed by the King's representative to, in the words of Professor Burroughs, make some principles explicit that were in the written version of the proclamation. Make things that were implied in the Royal Proclamation explicit in an oral interpretation to kind of define those. Nearly 250 years later, this wampum was invoked by our current Governor General, David Johnson, and he was speaking at the 2012 Crown First Nations gathering in Ottawa, and he acknowledged the covenant chain presented by Sir William Johnson represented the core of the Crown's relationship with its First Nations allies. So it's a relevant document to this day. When looked at holistically, together, the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara can properly be seen as one of the many Magna Cartas that live and grow in these lands. And the gathering at Niagara extended something called the Great Covenant Chain of Friendship, and you can see it represented there on either side, right here. This relationship symbolized by a silver chain that must be polished regularly. We have to get together, we have to communicate this, we have to talk about this regularly, and it extended it into these lands. Another fascinating thing about this belt that Ken Miracle showed me, and Alan talked about as well, was the unfinished diamond here and the unfinished diamond here, because this belt represents kind of European linear, right? That's our way of thinking. We live on a timeline. There's your date, and then you put it together, and you get that cycle, the circle. So as a document, it merges two worldviews together. Now, as a story for this land, this is an extraordinary one, and it's one that very few Canadians actually know. And hopefully that changes. At the core of this is a family relationship with the sovereign, with the king or the queen. This relationship was intended to inform future treaties, including the number treaties and the modern treaties formed with the crown. The Silver Covenant Chain of Friendship also reinforced that the treaty relationship is a personal one. It's a kinship with the king regardless of the government or the political developments of the day. And this is something that lieutenant governors and governors general are returning to right now. There's movements that are going on in this country right now, and we're seeing them trying to re-engage. What is treaty? This is something that I think Canadians, non-Indigenous, need to understand. And the way I explain it to my students is this. I ask them what they think, what word they would use for treaty. And they immediately think of, and I ask them, like, what treaty would you be in right now? And what do students immediately think of when they think of being bound with something? Their cell phones. They think of their cell phone companies, the contracts that they have with cell phones, right? That's the reality of the classroom right now. And so the words that immediately come to mind when you think of like a contract are these words: signed, money, conditions, lawyers, these sorts of things, a written document. But when you shift that word and you say it's a relationship, and you ask students to brainstorm what that means, different words come out of their mouths to describe it. Trust and communication, honesty, patience, openness, empathy, respect, and a big one, and kids really clue into this, boys and girls, doesn't matter the age, love. Love is really, really important. Treaty is a verb. It's not a noun. If treaties are understood to be relationships, certain descriptors come to mind as parties articulate what qualities must exist in order for their success. The words here. Love must be understood to be the foundation of all treaty. And lieutenant governors are getting this. The governor and the governor general is realizing this. Just recently, at an address at Lakehead University, the lieutenant governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Dowdwell, explored the idea of love woven into every treaty. And she said, the love that is meant is often described as kinship. The Crown is bound in kinship with Indigenous peoples. She then went on to say, relationships, particularly those between family members, have flexibility that allow for disagreements and even estrangement. However, no matter the conflict, with family, there's always a path left open for reconciliation. Such relationships must have elements of the abstract if they're to work properly. Treaty can be seen as abstract, but that's the point. Relationships are complex and often ill-defined because they have to be in order to evolve and survive. Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples are very different, with distinct languages, concepts of time, space, and so forth. Treaties must live in the abstract in order for such differing and sometimes opposing worldviews to coexist, because it gives us a chance to evolve towards one another. Governor General Johnson said just last year at a Treaty 4 protocol ceremony, he defined treaties as living, breathing documents. They're forward-looking. They matter to all of us because they lie at the heart of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And the Governor General went on to remark, and Treaty 4 specifically is fundamental to the relationship between the Crown and First Nations that you represent. Our relationship flows from this treaty, and today we have a chance to strengthen and reinvigorate that relationship. That sort of language would have been unheard of under the previous government just five years ago. The Crown also exists in the metaphysical realm, making it the preferred conduit through which we are bound in treaty. The monarchy, like treaty, requires us to use words that are far more allegorical, imbued with subtle meanings and histories. Lieutenant Governor Dowdeswell, continuing her speech in Lakehead, said, "Our constitutional monarchy, which has evolved over 1,000 years, requires us to have an understanding of symbolism and words that often stray into an abstract realm, that are imbued with history and subtlety. Exploring the institution of the Crown often steers us towards the same language that must be used in order to properly describe treaty. A concrete definition of the Crown must always remain just beyond our reach. Canadians know this. For the Crown, it is through the process of trying to define what it is that the institution naturally becomes a reflection of society, a reflection that's constantly changing. The Queen herself says, the Crown is not so much defined by what it does, just by the fact that it exists, she says. I must be seen to be believed. University professor Daniel K. Richter notes in his book, Beyond the Covenant Chain, he noticed, or he was looking at the treaty notes, and he said, the process of treaty making was always far more important to, his word, Indians, than the results enshrined in the treaty document, that the process or the journey is more important than the destination itself. And we now find ourselves in the midst of Canada's commemorations of the 150th anniversary of Confederation, which was a devastating erosion of these original relationships in our lands. The minds of the colonial government of the day, or in the minds of the colonial government of the day, felt that the king's place at the council fire would now be taken, that place would be taken by the federal government, that they would sit in the place of the Crown. Even while the Treaty of Niagara was being negotiated, the power of King George as the monarch was being curtailed by what the English political writer Walter Bagehot called two separate things. He said there's a dignified crown and an efficient crown. The dignified crown is all the bells and whistles. The efficient crown is what the government does, and the government being the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. But this reality that was emerging in Britain at the time was never articulated in treaty. In fact, the exact opposite. Beyond 1764, the gulf between these two versions of the Crown grew larger in British political life. And here, with the crystallization of things called responsible government, and then the emergence of Canada as a distinct political entity, thanks to Confederation, served to displace the very foundations of our treaties. The 1931 Statute of Westminster legally created a distinct Canadian Crown, although with a shared monarch, independent of its British ancestor. When Elizabeth II ascended the throne in this country in 1952, she did so as the Queen of Canada, a separate office that was bestowed on her by the Parliament of Canada the following year. In fact, since the establishment of our first treaty relationships, many non-Indigenous people have repeatedly reimagined the Crown in these lands without consulting or seeking the consent of the nations that are bound with it. For many Indigenous people, their relationships are with the British Crown, and the Canadian Crown is nothing more than an interloper. This remains a major hurdle to be resolved. But rather than focusing on the political and constitutional contortions brought about with the Crown over the last century and a half, and instead returning to the very roots of the treaty relationship, the kinship, the family relationship between the Queen and Indigenous peoples, indispensable roles for the Queen and her representatives are revealed. Because to this day, constitutionally, the Queen is the embodiment of the Canadian state. Her Majesty and her representatives remain at the apex of our political system. Indeed, trying to understand the delicate bonds holding this federation together is impossible without encountering its constitutional monarchy. However, what Canadians need to realize is that the kinship between the sovereign and Indigenous people are separate and distinct roles at the heart of any treaty. So you can remove the Crown from Confederation and you risk the whole family coming apart. But if you eliminate the Queen from treaties, Canada's very existence becomes impossible. For many Indigenous nations, a vice-regal representative is not important because they represent the Queen of Canada in a particular jurisdiction. Rather, a Governor-General or a Lieutenant Governor is significant because they stand in for the Queen herself. For many, federal and provincial incarnations of the Crown have little meaning because in treaty, the personal relationship is the paramount one. The recent mandate letter instructing the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship to collaborate with the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs to make changes to the Canadian Oath of Citizenship to reflect the TRC's calls to action is an important step, I think, in educating Canadians about our most important relationships. Noticeably, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, recommends keeping the Crown in the oath. They just advocated for this addition. My apologies. I swear or affirm, the red is what they want included. I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Your Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including treaties with Indigenous peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. The retention of the Queen is important. Is as important as the inclusion of treaties, because the very act of swearing allegiance to the sovereign engages new citizens in the relationships that she's bound in. The Queen remains the conduit for new Canadians to enter into treaty relationships with First Nations, and the new oath will serve as a reminder to Canadians, new and old, of the important role of the Crown that is played on their behalf. There are also events going on in the country that highlight this historic role. Currently, Queen Elizabeth II has only 2 royal chapels outside of the United Kingdom. These are churches that serve her spiritual needs. Both chapels are in Canada, and both are found on Indigenous territory with the Mohawk Nation. One is Her Majesty's Royal Chapel of the Mohawks, which is at the Six Nations of the Grand River, and the other is Her Majesty's Chapel Royal of the Mohawk, which is at the Bay of Quinte First Nation. This year, in fact, June 21st, the Queen will establish a new royal chapel, the first on Anishinaabe territory, in partnership with Massey College and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Woven into that space will be a mural depicting the 1764 Council of Niagara. The mural is being done by renowned artist Phil Cote, as well as a stained glass window executed by Sarah Hall. And embedded in that stained glass window will actually be that belt right there. The wampum will be given as a gift from Queen Elizabeth II and will be housed in cedar within that window. By presenting such a gift to the chapel, Elizabeth II will polish the silver covenant chain of friendship anew and elevate that wampum itself from a vice-regal, instead of just the king's representative, now it's coming from the Queen herself. It's the hope that this chapel, founded in the 21st century during the bicentenary of Confederation, will become a space committed to the future of Canada and its relationships with Indigenous peoples. It'll be a contemporary space, intimately linked to the relationships that were first established in the 17th century. This is a picture of what it looks like now, but it will be altered. The Mississaugas will be altering it. Massey's Chapel manifests the cyclical relationship referenced by the covenant chain, and it emphasizes that the Crown can be a medium linking contemporary Canada with ancient relationships that were meant to be the foundations of our society. The Crown manifested in this space will be uncorrupted, and it's representing our very best intentions. In offering his support for the project, the chief of the Mississaugas, Chief Stacy Laforme, wrote the following. He said, and I'm going to give you the long quote instead of just the short one here. He said, "The Royal Proclamation cannot be properly interpreted unless it's combined with the Treaty of Niagara. And treaties can't be properly interpreted unless it's combined with, and treaties cannot be understood without acknowledging the relationship Indigenous peoples have with the Queen and her family. The chapel will serve to remind Canadians of these truths. My people's ancestors were at Niagara when the Silver Covenant chain of friendship was extended into these lands over 250 years ago. And it's in the spirit of that gathering that this chapel will serve as a place to gather regularly and polish the chain for this and future generations. Confederation set aside our treaty relationships, beginning a very dark chapter in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples on these lands. The establishment of this Royal Chapel, a space to reflect, learn, and reconnect by the Queen and Massey College community 150 years later, is a profound act of reconciliation. It will become, in effect, a new council fire for our peoples to gather around in love and friendship. Examples of the Crown's official representatives reinterpreting and re-engaging with their relationships with Indigenous peoples can be found across the country in the past couple of years. In 2013 at Fort Qu'Appelle, the Honourable Yvonne Solomon Schofield, who's the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, took part in a sweat lodge ceremony, and she was invited by Rita and Herman Blind, a former aide-de-camp. The Lieutenant Governor's participation in such a personal event was a healing moment for an office that could trace its roots back to the controversial Edgar Dewdney, who was the first Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan. He's the person who came up with the pass system. If you don't know what the pass system is, there's a wonderful documentary on it. Completely illegal and completely monstrous. And he is honored as the first Lieutenant Governor. He has a street named after him. Recounting the meeting where the invitation to the sweat lodge was extended to Schofield, Communications Manager Carolyn Spears shared that it felt like a meeting of family as we sat in a circle together, ensconced in her honors receiving room. When asked to articulate her viceregal role in relation to Indigenous people, the Lieutenant Governor provided the following statement. She said, "I feel very privileged to have participated in a sweat lodge and to walk among the elders, chiefs, and veterans in a powwow grand entry. Through these remarkable experiences and my visits to Indigenous communities, I have viewed my role as one of listening and sharing as we move forward in healing and reconciliation. By rediscovering their intended relationships that were the hallmarks of treaty, Governors General and Lieutenant Governors are realizing the potential of their offices by realigning them with their intended purposes as conduits through which non-Indigenous peoples can connect with their brothers and sisters." Speaking in 2015, the Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick said, "My office is a direct and symbolic link to our democratic process, but it's also a physical link, extending to the people and to the province itself, the territory, the ground, the land, to Mother Earth. I respect you, your cultures, your customs and traditions. I believe as much as it is important to have strong roots and a notion of where we come from, it is also important to know where we are going. Wherever it may be, it will always be toward the future. And today we are moving ahead with open hearts." She invoked this again the following year, this year, when she said, "We must better understand each other and to learn to appreciate our differences, but also what we share in common. We sit under one tree, the tree of life, enjoying its beauty and giving thanks to Mother Earth and to the Creator. We can all gather under that tree to find wisdom, power, healing, reconciliation, peace, and friendship. And we need to learn to understand one another, to tolerate, to have respect for one another and for our relationships." And again, language like that coming out of a Lieutenant Governor is a significant event. Much work has been done in Nova Scotia as well by Brigadier General the Honourable J.J. Grant to rehabilitate one of the most contentious relationships in the country. Nova Scotia's viceregal office, one of the oldest in the country, encompasses such controversial predecessors as a man named Edward Cornwallis, who was the founder of Halifax and author of the infamous Scalping Proclamation of 1764, where he invited members of the community, non-Indigenous, to scalp the local Mi'kmaq population. Grant's recent decision to host a ceremony to commemorate the treaty relationship at Government House in 2016 was commended by Mi'kmaq Grand Chief Syliboy, who said, "The Mi'kmaq treaties will continue to be integral in the future relationship between Nova Scotia and the representative of the Queen." And he added, "We are convinced that the relationship the treaties represent can guide the way to a shared future in Canada and Nova Scotia." Speaking at the ceremony himself, the Lieutenant Governor said, "A key concept that we should keep in mind when considering the importance of treaties, and indeed all citizens' relationships with the Constitution and the government in the broadest sense, is what is known in Mi'kmaq as Elewake," I'm totally mispronouncing that, which translates as "the king in our house." It's a concept that the sovereign is an ally and not an oppressor, but a protector and a friendly ally. This Mi'kmaq concept is centuries old, and it dovetails nicely with the modern concept of the crown as an institution that reigns but doesn't rule. Grant continued his exploration by differentiating the relationship between the crown and the province from that with Indigenous peoples. He said, "It is often easy to see the crown and our queen as a far-off and detached symbol. Yet beyond the role I play as the sovereign's representative in Nova Scotia, there is a very special connection that exists between the Mi'kmaq nation and Her Majesty." He sees it as separate and distinct. The following year, the Premier, the Grand Chief, and other dignitaries in Halifax gathered at Government House to witness the granting of a pardon to Grand Chief Gabriel Syliboy by Lieutenant Governor Grant, which recognized that the Grand Chief's conviction 90 years earlier had violated treaty rights. While the pardon was the result of the government of the day, its issuance by the representative of the Queen underscored its importance to the Mi'kmaq and to Nova Scotian society as a whole. Working within the conventions of responsible government, the Lieutenant Governor said, "Talking and listening, sharing and dreaming together, that's how we heal. And that's how we'll move towards reconciliation. Today's event and the free pardon are an element of the broader conversation which involves everyone." And when he pronounced the pardon, the Lieutenant Governor said, "The Crown, which I represent on behalf of the Queen, exercises the duty at the direction of the democratically elected government. But for all of those on this side of the table, the Crown, the Mi'kmaq government, and all Nova Scotians, we are part of this. And for all of my side, we apologize for the past injustices and undertake to atone for these misdeeds." You might remember last fall the recent visit of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge to British Columbia. And in that, I don't know who wrote this, but a remarkable description of the Crown was given in the schedule of events. And it said as follows. This was all about an event that was going to happen when the Duke would add a ring of reconciliation to the black rod, the legislature's black rod, which is what they knock on the door with, if you remember the opening of Parliament. And this was the brief that was given to the media, and it said, "His Royal Highness installs a final ring of reconciliation to embody the historic relationship of the sovereign as the guardian and protector of the Aboriginal peoples." Such a description echoes the Royal Proclamation of 1763, as well as the sentiments of David Onley, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, who a few years ago said there's a historic, legal, and ethical obligation between the Viceregal office and the Aboriginal people of Ontario. That this was written by the government, so this wouldn't have been written by anybody associated with the Lieutenant Governor's office, is an extraordinary statement, I think, from the Government of Canada to write. It suggests an active role for the Crown, for the Lieutenant Governor, for the royal family and their representatives with regards to its relationships with Indigenous peoples. This is especially true when you look at the rights that they already have. So a Lieutenant Governor in our current political system has the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. I would add to this as well, they also have an extraordinary power to convene. This ability to gather people together from all facets of society into the same room to listen and to talk to one another. Lieutenant Governor Dowdeswell articulated this last June 21st, when she gathered with the Governor General. She brought a bunch of people together at Brantford's residential school at the Mush Hole. And she said there, "One of the greatest privileges I have as a Lieutenant Governor is the power to convene. By bringing people together, the institution of the Crown is able to spark new relationships and encourage innovative partnerships. And there is no more an important conversation than how we will live together, sustainably and equitably. How we can reimagine a country that is true to its values and strong in its diversity." I'm just going to skip ahead because I've been told I'm running short on time. Since the Queen and her representatives occupy the very heart of our democracy, they provide us as conduits in which to engage with our treaty partners. A unique feature of our constitutional monarchy is that the federal and provincial crowns, the Governor General and the Lieutenant Governor, allow Her Majesty's relationship to adapt to meet the needs of specific regions and nations, and they're beginning to engage. The only thing that's holding them back, in my opinion, is Canadians not understanding what their role is. Part of that education that's going on within their own offices is producing some really profound statements. And for me, this is the most profound one. This was articulated by Lieutenant Governor Dowdeswell just 2 months ago, where she said, as the representative of the Queen, the highest office in this province, I am privileged to fulfill my duty of friendship with Indigenous peoples in treaty. It is a sacred trust, as relevant as my duty to ensure the province always has a functioning government. That is her most important constitutional function, and she's saying that it is as important as maintaining her treaty relationship. As we learned from the important work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the residential school program sought to destroy Indigenous languages and replace them with those that included concepts such as ceding and property ownership and land surrenders. If we see the violence committed through the residential school program through the lens of our treaty relationships, they become attacks on members of our family, and in particular their children. The lack of education around Canada's foundational institutions, such as the Crown, has contributed to the gulf between non-Indigenous Canadians and First Nations. And part of reconciliation includes a re-engagement by Canadians in the mediums that once allowed us to communicate with each other. In this year, we commemorate the 150th anniversary of Confederation, a moment in history that redefined non-Indigenous settlement on these lands. Confederation and the federal and provincial governments it established, subsumed and attempted to forcibly replace treaty relationships across this land. Confederation also opened the door to the establishment of the Indian Act and the residential school program that flowed from it. The Indian Act remains the law of the land to this day. These are some of the truths that we need to face before reconciliation can begin. Canada is a state founded in colonialism. The Crown as an institution was co-opted in that colonialism. However, that was not its intended role. It had another purpose. The Queen and her representatives are integral to our journey. They are, after all, family. The vice-regal representatives of Canada are re-engaging with their treaty partners across the country, restoring a symmetry that once existed at the heart of Indigenous and non-Indigenous coexistence in these lands. And as the Duke of Cambridge said to the Haida Nation on September 30th, he said, the historic link between the Crown and First Nations people is strong and something that I hold dear to my heart. It is a relationship key to the continued evolution of the Canadian state, linking its ancient institution to the promise of a future filled with peace, friendship, and respect. Thank you.